Hey everybody. I thought maybe we could continue reading Misty of Chincoteague. If anybody else is watching with you, you might want to catch them up on what happened before now. But if you recall, the last time we read was during the storm. Remember, and Paul was looking for Misty all through the corral with all the horses running around and the stallions and the lightning and the rain. And finally he found her in Grandpa Beebe's trailer along with the Phantom, her mother. And remember, he had to stand still for a long time and hold his hand out and try and get the Phantom not so worried about him. And finally he slid down to the floor because he couldn't stand up any longer after hours and hours. And eventually the Phantom did come over and smell his hand, and then Misty kind of fell asleep and her head landed on top of him and he fell asleep, and that was where we left them. So this is chapter 12, The Sold Rope. "Paul," whispered Grandpa in the low voice he used when children and wild animals were asleep. "Paul, boy." At the sound of Grandpa's voice, the Phantom neighed shrilly. Misty scrambled to her feet, swayed, then slid awkwardly along the floor of the truck. With a hungry little bleat, she found her mother's side and began nursing. Paul opened his eyes, then quickly shut them. If this were a dream, he wanted to spin it out and make it last until the end of time. He wished Grandpa's voice would fade away, but it kept pricking him awake. "Come, boy. Grandma is nigh crazy with worry over you. The big pine tree fell atop the house last night, and the Atlantic Ocean wetted our dooryard. I just couldn't come for you till now." Paul pulled himself up. His muscles ached. He could feel the wide stripes made by the boards of the truck across his back. He looked down at his long expanse of bare legs and suddenly remembered that he was wearing nothing but Grandpa's jacket over his underwear. He grinned at Grandpa. Grandpa winked back. "I see you scamped my belongings," he chuckled. "It's any port in a storm, lad." Then he thought of his message. "Grandma's mixed some goose grease with onion syrup for you. You're apt to catch a terrible fever," he quoted Grandma. But all the while his eyes were fondling the dam and her colt. Fondling, that means touching, like you love somebody, like a little kid, you would rub them on the head. That's called fondling. He was doing that with his eyes, looking at them. "She says you've got to come home and go to bed." Paul felt the stickiness of his hand where the Phantom had nuzzled it. His voice tensed. "I can't leave, Grandpa. Today's the sale. We've got to buy the Phantom and Misty." "Maureen can tend to that whilst you get some sleep. I don't know what in thunderation made me protect that little feller for you last night. I must be getting addled in my old age. Now help me get the pair of 'em out in the truck and back in the corral so you can buy 'em legal-like at the sale." But there was no need for help. With the truck backed up close to the corral gate, the Phantom flew down the ramp. She smelled the rain-washed grass. She was crazy to get to it. Misty followed, a silver fluff of a shadow. The pony penning grounds were waking up when Maureen rode in on watch eyes. Volunteer firemen were clearing the damage done by the storm. Trucks bearing licenses from Maryland, New York, North Carolina, Washington, D.C. were beginning to line up close to the colt pens. A few children, their faces still flushed with sleep, darted here and there, talking to themselves. "That little black pony, I could name him Black Beauty. I want the one with the white stockings." "How-do, Maureen?" called Tom, who on ordinary days was an oysterer. That means somebody who digs oysters for money. "You're up and about mighty early. Reckon you're sharpening your appetite for the big dinner this noon. Or maybe you come to buy my last 2 chances on the sorrel pony being given away on Sunday?" And with a great flourish, he whipped the tickets out of his pocket. Maureen could think of no answer. She was not interested in the sorrel pony. She had forgotten all about the dinner to be served in the big dining hall on the grounds. She managed to smile at Tom and thank him politely. Then, feeling of the money pouch around her neck and the piece of rope over her shoulder, she stated her business quickly. "I came to see the fire chief," she said. "Nowhere's about. He's been and gone." "Oh, anything I can do for you?" "Reckon not." "Well, he'll be back before you can say Chincoteague Isle." Tying watch eyes to a tree, Maureen wandered about the grounds, waiting for the chief. She stopped at the colt pens and noticed that several of the shaggy-coated youngsters already wore sold ropes around their necks. She noticed, too, that most of them were beginning to eat for themselves. Only a few were whimpering for their mothers. The fire chief was right, she thought. They're learning to be grown-ups. She felt good towards the whole wide world as she walked toward the big corral. She watched 2 stallions fighting, dancing on their hind legs, lashing out with their forelegs. A news photographer was getting a picture of them. Finally, she climbed the fence and jumped inside the corral. The wild ponies were refreshed by the rain. They thundered past and around her. They paid her no more attention than if she had been a small tree. She was nothing but an obstacle to avoid. She stood listening to the wild music of their hooves. She liked to feel the little gusts of wind made by their flying bodies. She liked the sight of their manes and tails frisking with the wind. The Pied Piper's band was on the far side of the corral. He was policing his family, keeping his mares in a bunch. Maureen saw Misty stretched out at her mother's feet. Her heart warmed at the sight of them. She walked over to them, slowly, slowly. If she could slip the sold rope over Misty's head, it would save all the struggle later. The firemen had no time to ease up to the ponies. With 100 or more colts to sell, they had to work fast. Often 2 men had to pick up a pony by its tail and its head in order to fasten a sold rope about its neck. Meanwhile, the ponies screamed and fought and struggled to get away. Probably it doesn't hurt, thought Maureen, but I'd like to save Misty all that scared feeling. Suddenly her eyes flew wide with horror. The phantom was tugging at a rope tied around Misty's neck. A sold rope! "No, no, no!" Maureen shrieked. "Phantom!" she cried hysterically. "You're the only one who can unsell her! Try harder, harder, harder!" Phantom was doing her best. With her big yellow teeth, she was trying to sever the rope. That means cut it. But Misty would pull away, thinking her mother was playing. She opened her little coat's mouth, biting back, neighing fiercely. Maureen looked around helplessly. Just then she spied the fire chief coming toward the corral with Tom at his heels. She ran to them. "Misty's wearing a sold rope," she cried. "Misty's been sold." Then her voice failed her. "Who's been sold?" asked the chief, puzzled. "Who?" echoed Tom. "Misty," she choked, trying to swallow her tears. The fire chief knotted his brows. "Now, suppose you tell me who Misty is," he said kindly. "Why, she's the Phantom's colt, and Paul and I, we've been saving for months to buy the Phantom, and now we want both her and her colt, and we have $102, she added breathlessly as she patted the money around her neck. "Right here in Grandpa's tobacco pouch. And in 4 months more, we can save up another 100. I could go clamming, and I can catch soft-shell crabs, and Paul can shuck oysters, and Uncle Ralph will give us his night catch of fatbacks, and Paul and I can go up and down the streets calling, 'Fatbacks for sale! Nice fresh fatbacks for sale!'" "Well, why in thunder didn't you kids tell me?" exploded the fire chief. Then his voice quieted. "I'm sorry, Maureen, I didn't know. Why, less than an hour ago, a man by the name of Foster came through on his way to Norfolk, Had business there, he said, and couldn't get back until after the sale. I asked Tom here to show him around, and he took a fancy to the filly's markings." "He bought Misty?" "Paid $50 down," nodded the chief. "Insisted on buying the Phantom too, just so the colt will get a good start in life." He took a deep breath. "Tom and I," he added, "tied the sold rope around the colt's neck, but it's going to take a lot more than two of us to handle that Phantom." Maureen watched the sun slide out from behind a low cloud and make diamonds of the raindrops in the grass. She turned her back on it. How could the sun shine when things went wrong? The fire chief clasped and unclasped his cane. "I had no idea," he spoke quietly. "If you had only said something about it yesterday." Maureen was about to leave, but Tom called her back. "How's about taking my last chances on the sorrel?" he suggested. "There's a gentle critter, and you'd still have $100 to spend on candy and things." Maureen raised her eyes to Tom. Then she smiled at him through her tears. She felt sorry for Tom. "Guess he's never really wanted anything," she thought, as she slowly walked over to untie Watch Eyes. Chapter 13. A pony changes hands. Paul took the news without a word, but all the sunburn suddenly washed out of his face, leaving it pinched and white. The day passed in a kind of dream. Both Paul and Maureen tried to stay away from the grounds, but something drew them there. Yet they no longer belonged to the happy crowds. They were onlookers now, like hungry people on the outside of a restaurant window. Sick with longing, they watched colts being tugged and pushed and lifted into waiting cars. Some went off in station wagons, some in trailers, some in dealers' trucks. Many of them squealed and kicked and fought. A few were too frightened to even struggle. They stared fixedly as Grandpa bought a truckload of yearlings. "Soon we'll be gentling them for someone else," Maureen said sadly to Paul. That day was to be so full of excitement. The day that was to be so full of excitement dragged out. Even the merry-go-round with its brightly painted ponies and its brassy music did not help them forget. To Paul, the music kept wheezing, "You found and lost Misty, you found and lost Misty, you found and lost Misty." To Maureen, it was a noisy mockery. "We'll have us another hoss family, just as pretty, maybe prettier," promised Grandpa Beebe as they sat at a table in the dining room hall at noon. But Grandpa's words sounded bigger than his voice. The ladies of the auxiliary hovered over them anxiously, heaping their plates with oysters and clam fritters and great helpings of Chincoteague pot pie. "Land sakes!" exclaimed a motherly person to Paul and Maureen. "What's the matter with you two young'uns? Such puny appetites? Take my Delbert now, he's on his fourth helping." But try as they would, Maureen and Paul could not eat. The food that usually tasted so good lodged in their throats. Even Grandpa Beebe had no appetite. "If I didn't know 'twas plump oysters and rolled out dumplings with chunks of chicken," he said, "I'd swear I was eating bran mash." That's what they feed the horses. In the afternoon, there was the bronco busting. It was like any Wild West show, except there were no mountains in the distance, only fishing boats in the sea and gulls flying and a soft wind singing in the pines. The wild ponies, crazed with fright, were let out of chutes. Chutes are long, narrow pens with an opening at the end where they kept the ponies until it was time to let them out, and then they let them out and they go crazy and run out. While the crowds gasped and shrieked, the ponies crow-hopped, they bucked, they threw their riders at once or tolerated them for brief seconds. The people cheered madly when an oyster-tonger wearing a red baseball cap and holding a big unlighted cigar in his mouth stayed on his bronco for a matter of minutes. And just when he was doffing his cap and bowing to the crowds, the pony tossed him and his cigar and red cap high into the air. An instant's pause, then such a whooping and laughter went up as he recovered his cigar and pulled his cap over his face that it was heard by Grandma at the kitchen at Pony Ranch. Paul and Maureen watched, but they were not really a part of the laughing, cheering crowd. Thursday night, Friday passed. The Pied Piper and all the broodmares except the Phantom were driven into the channel to swim back to Chincoteague for another year of freedom. It was Saturday before Paul and Maureen were able to talk about their loss. They were in the dooryard taking turns grinding clams for Grandma. "If only I had never gone on the roundup," Paul said bitterly. Maureen shook her head. "It was my fault. If only I'd gotten to the grounds at 4 instead of 5. That's in the morning. "If only I'd told the fire chief the night before. What do we do with the $102? Maureen asked. A long silence was broken by the squeaking of the crank. Squeak, squeak, squeak. "We could buy Grandma and Grandpa one of those electric toasters," Paul said at last. "And we could save the rest to go to college on the mainland when we get grown." "Let's do it," Maureen agreed, but without much enthusiasm. Later that morning, as they were looking at electric toasters in a window on Main Street, they heard a man's voice call, "Hi there!" They turned around to see a station wagon at the curb with a man and a small boy in the front seat. The man leaned past the boy and poked his head out of the window. "Can you tell us where the fire chief lives?" he asked. "Yes, sir," replied Paul. "He lives up the 2nd Street, 3rd house from the corner. But I reckon he's still at the grounds. They're having a drawing on the sorrel this morning." The boy's head shot out of the car. "The drawing's over!" he exclaimed. "And guess what?" "What?" asked Paul and Maureen. "I won the pony!" he said breathlessly. "That's right," nodded the man, who did not seem to share the boy's eagerness. "And now we've got to see the fire chief. He went off in his car before we could find him. By the way," the man questioned, "do you two know him?" Paul and Maureen managed a smile. "Everybody knows him," they said. The next moment they spied the chief's car turning in at a gas station on the opposite corner. "I'll get him for you," Paul said, and he ran across the street. Mused the chief as he limped back with Paul. "Looks to me like Foster, the man from Norfolk. Only before he didn't have a boy with him." "Is he the one who bought Misty and Phantom?" Paul said quickly. The chief nodded. By now the man and the boy had gotten out of the station wagon. "How do?" said the fire chief. "Good morning," replied the man. He took off his hat and began twirling it nervously in his hands. He cleared his throat, then he pulled a clean white handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his forehead. "This is Freddie, my young son, and we..." He hesitated a moment and then hurried the words. "And we have a problem. You see, the other morning your man Tom sold us a chance on a pony, and I forgot all about it. That is, until this morning when I stopped off at the grounds to show Freddie the tiny foal I had bought for him." "Tell him, Daddy, tell him!" interrupted Freddie. "Just as we stepped out of the car," Mr. Foster continued, "they were raffling off the sorrel colt and..." "We won!" shouted Freddie. "No!" exclaimed the chief, and Paul and Maureen saw the tired look suddenly lift from his face. "We won! We won!" cried Freddie. "Now tell him the rest, Daddy, tell him." Mr. Foster spoke very quickly now, as if the sooner told the better. "You see, sir, Freddie likes the sorrel pony because it's almost the color of my horse. He likes it better than the newborn foal." Paul and Maureen could hardly breathe. They were staring at Mr. Foster as if they could not believe what they had heard. "Of course," Mr. Foster added, "I appreciate that pony pinning day is over and you may not have another chance to sell the little foal. In that case," he said, putting his hat back on his head, "in that case, why, we'll just have to hold to our bargain. Though what we'll do with 2 colts and how we'll get that wild Phantom home has me worried." There was a long moment of stillness. An old man came along wheeling a cart of squash and watermelons. As the man went by, a dog lying in the doorway of the hardware store thumped his tail noisily. Across the street, a jukebox was spilling out the words, "Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam." Still, the chief made no answer. Instead, he hooked his cane over Paul's shoulder. Then he took a notebook out of his pocket and slowly, carefully began thumbing through it, reading notations on each page. Finally, he tore a leaf out of the book and took a $50 bill out of his wallet, handed the money and the page of writing to Mr. Foster, and he said, "There was a boy and a girl had their eyes on the mare and her colt. I can't be sure," he said with a wink, "but I've a mind they still might be interested." Maureen gave a little gasp. Then she picked up the astonished Freddie and gave him a sound kiss. "Don't mind her," Paul said to Freddie. "Just girls' fribble." Then he grabbed the fire chief's hand and wrung it until his own ached. He shook hands with Mr. Foster too, and even with Freddie. At last he threw back his head like a spirited horse and let out such a loud whinny that it was heard the full length of Chincoteague Island. Nay! Okay.